set of lights here. Elizabeth, just in the back row there. Galen. My name is Mark Worthing. I work as a climate and conservation campaigner at Sierra Club BC. Nukwam Gyawalakulis, Nukwam Mamatla. I'm an adopted Mamatla, a non-Indigenous person, into the Maltakela tribe of the Kwakwaka'wakw people, of which the Comox are one. And so it is part of my responsibility and my privilege to be able to set a tone for public discourse, especially when it comes to talking about natural resources, ecosystems, and the way in which we gain a living off of the land in this beautiful place we know as Comox. So I'd like to go a couple notches beyond territory acknowledgement, because I think that there's a certain opportunity to, instead of just pay lip service to the history of this place, both the beauty and the duress that's taking place here, and I think it's a really exciting one. And so, with acknowledging that we are gathered here on the unceded territory of the Kwakwaka'wakw, Comox, and also this Safloot territory, Safloot's cultural grouping, because there are many nations all through here, the Puntledge and Comox and further north. But I want to hit pause at the word unceded and roll back for a half a second to a bit of a history lesson, which you may or may not know, but it's nice to take ourselves there anyways, just as a reminder, which is that after the 30 Years' War in Europe, the different fiefdoms and church groups and land barons and families of royalty came together to find terms of peace. How is it that all of these entities on a single land base can come to respect one another and each other's land bases in some sort of semi-organized fashion? And so it was after the 30 Years' War that the Peace of Westphalia was established, the Treaty of Westphalia, and it was here, I don't even know the date, 1630, anybody? Peace of Westphalia? European historians in the audience. It was here that the very first definition of sovereignty was born. And in this definition of sovereignty were the terms of which sovereignty could be claimed, taken, fought over, etc., etc. And it's in this Treaty of Westphalia where the term cessation or to cede, terra firma, an actual place, a physical landmass, was first iterated in terms of European thought, philosophical European thought and control. And so cessation, as defined by Western European intellectual thought at the time, was the acquisition of land in two ways. One was by war and conquest, of which had its own set of rules. You can't just go to war willy-nilly. There's prisoner of war laws, there's terms of engagement, etc., etc. So war itself has a lot of rules and regulations agreed upon by warring parties. So you can either cede land by way of war and conquest, and the rules thereunder, or by way of barter trade or gift. So the land could be bought or exchanged or traded, etc. So this is where cessation and sovereignty first got its definitions in European Western thought. Fast forward to 150 years ago, Hudson's Bay Company, traders, loyalists, 1864, I believe, is when the 49th parallel got designated and British sovereignty set in those terms over here. There was never a war. We never bought, traded, or bartered for this land base. I say we, speaking as a non-Indigenous person myself. So when we acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional territory of a given nation, we're referring to the ways that lands can be ceded: war, conquest, barter, trade. And none of those happened here. We've we've never paid reparations, damages in any way to the indigenous people of whom this is their land. We never really went to war with them either. The Americans kind of did. They did kind of go to war. So in a lot of places in the US, there is ceded territory. Now, there's disagreement about what that means in terms of the different agreements, et cetera, with the government in the US. But here, with or without treaties, there was no war and there was no transaction. So this is what we mean when we acknowledge we're on the unceded territory. So if I can hit play again on there, I just wanted to take a minute to sort of, probe that, go a little bit deeper when we're talking about territory acknowledgements and where we are. Just make sure we're situating ourselves in a certain manner. Question? 1648, nice. Someone's got a data blend. Maybe with that, I'll just turn it over to Galen real quick. We'll be passing the mic back and forth. So, cheers, Galen Tesla, and thank you for welcoming us into the space, both the North Island College and also Elizabeth and Claudette. Really appreciate your guys' work and for everyone coming here.
Hey everybody, thank you Mark for opening us up. And let's see if we can get this in the right place. There we go. I'm going to save my wrist and use the mic stand here. My name is Galen Armstrong. As he said, we're both with Sierra Club BC, which is based in Victoria on Lake Wangan territory, but it's a provincial organization. We do work all around the province, and we work within the context of climate change, so really it's global work that we're doing as well as local. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is, I want to just get you a little more oriented with who Sierra Club BC is. This is our staff. You can find Mark and myself in here. The staff, for the most part, works in Victoria out of our office there, with the exception of Jens Wieding, who is one of our forest campaigners, along with Mark, who works out of his home in Vancouver. We also have a board of directors, and the board is all around the province. Next slide. So a little bit about myself. This is me about 10 years ago up in Glacier Bay, Alaska. Claudette had mentioned that I've done a variety of work. I've done environmental education work with state parks in California and Oregon. I've done organizing work, activism work in Chicago and Mississippi. And this picture is taken in Glacier Bay, Alaska, southeastern Alaska, where I was a backcountry ranger for around, I guess, like half a year. And I spent my summer doing a few different things. One, doing backcountry patrols on kayaks and on foot, and making sure people out there in this vast park were safe and were able to get help if they needed it. And then the other part of the time, maybe the other half of the time almost, I was on the radio giving permits to cruise ships to come into the park, as well as giant personal yachts. And I remember talking to one guy who had come up from San Francisco in his yacht, and he was bragging about the tens of thousands of dollars that he'd spent in fuel to get there. And I thought, okay, well, I don't know, I want to be able to reach a few more people, because I was also spending the summer, you see that, we're looking up a fjord here. This is these are icebergs that have just calved off of this glacier in the background. So I spent the whole summer watching these glaciers calve, fall apart, school bus-sized chunks of ice falling into the ocean, melting. So I'm literally watching climate change happen in a very real way, in a tangible way. And I didn't feel like I was doing what I could do to make change. So that's when I left Alaska and took a job with the Environmental Law and Policy Center in Chicago, and I kind of started my journey in the nonprofit world. So it took me from Chicago to Mississippi to working with students at the two big Mississippi universities, getting renewable energy projects going, and then finally back up to here, BC, about 8-9 years ago, here where I was born. And so working with Sierra Club BC on a variety of issues and campaigns has been a really amazing education for me. I did my schooling in Oregon and then university in Northern California. So I didn't have much in the way of Canadian and British Columbian education, and the Sierra Club BC has kind of allowed me to gain that in the last 8 or 9 years. Next slide. And now here I am. This is what my life looks like today. These are my twin babies that I said goodbye to this morning in Duncan, where I live. So life is very much different than it was 10 years ago. They're having 4-month-old twin babies. I'm certain these are my first kids, so I'm seeing the world and seeing the climate crisis in a bit of a new light. It's not just about me and my generation's future, it's about this next generation. And for me, it's taking on a bit of a more serious tone, and I'm all the more proud to be doing the work that I'm privileged to do with Sierra Club BC. Next slide. So Sierra Club BC is in its 50th year. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. Started in 1969 here on Vancouver Island with a group of activists who were fighting to protect the West Coast Trail. It went through various iterations, but the little mini story there is that this group wanted to preserve the West Coast Trail, prevent it from being logged, and they said, after doing a bunch of work, they said, we should have a name, like we should be a group. And they knew about Sierra Club in the US, which had already existed for about 100 years, and they said, what if we just became Sierra Club, like Canada, or Sierra Club BC? And that's what they did. Time went along, and there was some, paper signed here and there. I won't give you the whole 50-year story, but as it is now, Sierra Club BC is a totally independent organization. We're a BC-based organization. We have very little ties to the U.S. group anymore, although we do have we have a very similar mission. We're fighting to protect wilderness, wild places in the context of climate change. Mark just brought up this book. There's a book. It's not by Sierra Club, but it's by Diana Pinch, who's long been a Sierra Club member, and she endeavored to write the history of Sierra Club's story. So if you want more detail on that story, check out this book. I feel like a talk show host now. Passion and Persistence, available in bookstores everywhere in BC. Next slide. So as part of our 50th anniversary, we're embarking on a 50 Places, 50 Stories project, where we're telling stories from across BC, a lot of stories where Sierra Club BC has been involved. A lot of the environmental fights in the last 50 years, Sierra Club BC has been there, and so we're kind of exploring those stories. Next slide, please. And if you check out our website, these are screenshots taken from our website, sierraclub.bc.ca. You can click through, and we've got it split into different regions of the province. Mark and I, between us, have worked on a lot of the campaigns in different parts of the province. We've both done work on the campaign to protect the Flathead River Valley in southeastern BC. Jens isn't here, but Jens did a lot of work on the Great Bear Rainforest Agreements. Of course, we're doing lots of work here in southwest BC. And like I mentioned, I've got family and roots in the Nelson area and the Courtenays. I also have done a lot of work as the Site C campaigner, the Peace Valley River campaigner, and I'll just put in a little plug there that I believe it's not too late to stop Site C, and it still should be stopped. But we're not talking about that today, so next slide. Today we're talking about old growth forests. That's what you came to hear about. So in just a second, I'm going to turn it back over to Mark. I'm really happy to be here with Mark today, because Mark is really has a vast wealth of knowledge. He's been in the forest more than just about anybody else I know. And I mean, this summer, I've just kind of followed his path online, and he's been in and out, and I'll let him talk about that, but in and out of old growth forests where they haven't logged yet, where they're currently logging, where they're going to log. So he has a pretty good handle on that. We went together on a trip back in late May, early June, up to Schmidt Creek and a couple of the other river valleys and stream valleys there, and saw what you might expect, some pretty terrible old growth logging that's happening right now. I'll pop in again towards the end of the presentation to talk about what I'm doing, my role in the forest campaign, is more around involving volunteers, getting people from around the province to get involved in what we're doing to protect old growth forests. But I'll turn it over now to Mark to talk about what's really happening in the forest. Thanks, Mark.
Cheers. Since we're at a college, I figured it was cool to lean a little heavier into the academic side of the conversation. And I was thinking to myself about forests and how diverse people's understanding of forests is. You say that word to people and it means a lot of different things depending on where they've come from, depending on how they gain a living, and depending on sort of what type of forest, what type of forested landscape people relate to. And so I took it all the way back. In Latin, the word forest just means outdoors or outside. And by the time this word in Latin sort of made its way into French, and then into, well, it was sort of it was forestus silva, and then shortened to forest with a T in français, and then by the time it made its way into Old English, forest was really a term that was midwifed from Latin, French, and then into Old English as a place where royalty or was under the king's possession of a wooded area meant for hunting. This is where this word comes from, forest. And it made me think that naturally, from the very linguistic roots of how we think about what a forest is, came this concept of dominion, control, management, and sort of a regal, royal sense of ownership. So ever since we started in the English language, in this linguistic tradition, ever since we've been talking about forest, it's been implied that this was a royal asset of dominion for their benefit and control. And should they let trickle-down effects go to their lessers, that would be upon them as good or bad kings and royalty, but even still it was part of dominion. So out of my respect and my own practices to sort of unpack the ways that I've been taught to think about forests as places meant for exploitation for the global market, I'm going to try just for this talk to use the Kwakwala word for forest, which is atli, just as a linguistic experiment, to sort of shift my own habits out of that. So atli is in the language group here and to the north, in Kwakwala, it's atli, A-T-L, with a cross in the L and an A, atli, sort of a slurpy cl in there. So with atli in mind, we live in one of the most unique ecosystems in the world. The temperate atli is about 4% of the Earth's surface. There's temperate forests in China, New Zealand, a couple spots in Europe, Norway, and then the largest temperate rainforest is here. Slide. Next slide. And it's, oh, interesting. Maybe try one more slide. There we go. So this is a coastal temperate atli, which is even less than 4%. Let's just run it at a 2%, 1.5% margin of coastal temperate rainforests, or atli. And then let's narrow it down even further to think about coastal temperate salmon supporting ecosystems, of which all of this, Glacier Bay, where Galen was talking about, where's Glacier Bay in relation to the green on this, Galen?
It's basically like that uppermost green.
Big bay there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, no, it's just to the right of that.
Okay.
It's a bit smaller. Yeah.
Okay, but it's in there.
Yeah.
So that is coastal temperate, and there's salmon running up some of those rivers, no?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And then take it all the way down into California, the start of the Columbia River further south there, Oregon. So this is a coastal temperate salmon subsidized and salmon based ecosystem which is probably in the margin of 0.5% or less than the Earth's surface. And for us, it's kind of easy to forget that. You know, it's all around us. Whether it's replanted forest or not, the ecosystem itself, the ecosystem function, is a coastal temperate salmon athlete. So this is a very rare place that we've found a home. And this will be the area that we're talking about, except we're going to zoom it in a little bit further. So next slide. And we know that in this coastal temperate salmon subsidized athlete, the marine ecosystem and the terrestrial ecosystem are inextricably linked. There's an incredible scene here where the sea meets the cedar, where salt water meets fresh. And that interchange by way of salmon between forest ecosystems and marine ecosystems creates incredible conditions for both culture and ecosystem function together. Next slide. And we know what this means for our livelihoods, for the ecosystems that we fall in love with, for the food sovereignty of Indigenous people, for the food sovereignty of non-Indigenous people. Next slide. And for the survival of the food of some of the other most remarkable species that have found this place in the coastal temperate salmon athlete, their home. And we also know that this is a huge problem right now. Those babies, Galen's kids that he put up there, may not see southern resident orcas that depend on Chinook that spawn in our forests here, in our athlete here, the way that, say, your generation or your parents' generation might have seen them in these waters. That's pretty real. And the way that we manage forests is the way that we manage for climate change. It's the way that we manage for fresh water, for fish, and then also those impacts in the marine environment. Next slide. Industrial logging is about 90, 80 years old, depending on how you kind of define, you know, when and how that began. I kind of think of sort of the origins of truck logging to be the beginning of large-scale industrial logging, when rubber tires, inflatable tires, were able to actually run tracks and weren't having to use trains and whatnot. So in about 90 or less than 100 years, 80 years, we've gone and taken, you can see productive, low, and second growth young forests, and then agricultural areas outlined. That's actually a gap in data in terms of forest stuff. You can imagine what the Lower Fraser would look like in terms of an estuarine forest system. Next slide. And we've reduced that athlete, that system, to a fraction of its original spread. And you can see some of these locations are outlined in parks. That's the Cormana Walt Rim, Pacific Rim, Strathcona, the Shone Lake, Sitka. We've got the Brooks, McQuinna Provincial Park, so on and so forth. And then outside of those parks and protected areas, you can see little patches of old growth there, the dark green. That's the productive old growth that we're usually most interested in. Highest carbon sequestration, highest cultural values, highest timber values. Usually is low elevation, but not always. They're bigger typically than a lot of other trees. Maybe go back a slide. Can we go back? And then forward a slide. And then back a slide. And forward a slide. So make no mistake, for better or for worse, say what you want about whether we needed logging or not. But this is the single largest land-based experiment that's ever happened in this part of the world. For better or for worse, you know, leaving the judgment or the value assessment aside, is a very large experiment that's happened with a single ecosystem in a single island. Next slide. And we try to work with the government as best we can to get more fulsome inventories of what's left in the different varying areas, biogeoclimatic zones as designated all across BC, but in particular on the coast. And we try and find the data that they have. But because of the generation of deregulation and the sort of outsourcing of a lot of the work in the forest to the private sector that's happened in the early 2000s up until about now and continuing, a lot of the data that I would have thought that the government and the public would have had access to is no longer. They don't know how much is left. The BC government has no idea. And they're working on it. You know, they're trying, they're kind of hustling away, lots of bureaucrats penciling away on a desk somewhere. But by and large, for the last decade and a half, it's been the logging companies doing the LiDAR analysis, doing the aerial analysis, recording what they've logged and what they have and how they're managing different landscapes. And that's proprietary information. So you and I, we don't have access to that. The BC government has just signed those rights away. They've outsourced that public interest work into the private sector. It's a regime called professional reliance and a results-based code. And it's very problematic in my opinion. So with this in mind, we have to do our own analysis. So we work with GIS people, mappers, pulling old data files, patchwork quilting together data and spatial files and then overlapping them so that we can actually break down by landscape unit how much is left where, and then associate that with the relative biogeoclimatic zone. Think about coastal Doug fir ecosystems, dry or Geary oaks are viewed as Doug fir down south of us really. And then, you know, relate that to coastal hemlock, you know, rich, dark, thick rainforest further up in the southern Great Bear, so on and so forth. So we kind of do this comparative analysis and we come up with numbers like these. Good medium quality, which we define as the high metabolism for water, high metabolism for carbon sequestration, high biomass, and then biodiversity. So this is high conservation value forests. And as we move down the rungs, we get into this sort of low, mid elevation, very low quality. That qualitative analysis might be something like a little bog, you know, halfway up Strathcona somewhere. Beautiful ecosystem, you know, nothing, no shame in that. But in terms of its, the magnitude of its biological capacity to process water, carbon, and provide biodiversity function is less productive in that framing than a lot of other lower elevation areas. So we parse that out a bit, right? What is this old growth that we're talking about? Next slide. And we do a lot of mapping, and the government doesn't do this. So the best data that you'll be able to get access to that is publicly available, publicly consumable, and completely transparent is this, it's us, which I'm proud of, but I'm also really ashamed of the government for not doing that work. This is work that I feel the government should be doing for the public. We should know, right? The commons, the collective should have some type of an awareness about this. So we put this out here. If anyone has any issues or questions or concerns, or better data, we welcome that. So if you're actually someone that's maybe worked in the forest sector before, you have access to data files, please bring them on in, because we process that and we add to this collective spatial data file set that we have that we build out our analysis with. And we actually think that the diversity of inputs creates stronger data and stronger shared information for the public. So this is the type of mapping we're doing. You can see we've broken it down by landscape unit. Again, there's the Carmanah Wallbrand down there in green. You move up, you've got Clackamas Sound. Where's Comox there? I think that little airplane there, a little south of there. Tuxedo, you can see in red and orange. That would be obviously both development and industrial logging. The E&N rail line there, the Lord Dunsmuir grant runs right up that line. So the coastal Doug fir ecosystem is some of the most impacted and most endangered on Vancouver Island. That's that southeast corner. And as you move up, you can see there's the Sitka there, that's in green. There's the Brooks McQuina landscape unit. And so say for example, the Sitka landscape unit up there, there's yellow on its right and orange on its left. That would be about 32, if I remember correctly, % left of remaining old growth forest that's never been logged before. Next slide. And then beyond doing the mapping, data analysis work, we take that and then we go jump in the trucks and we go ground truth it. And unfortunately, what we're finding is that even in the data that we are managing to scrape together, we're behind the gun. So on our maps, that block right there, that's all old growth behind it. You can see there's a younger block below it, but everything above that, that was all untouched forest. No one had ever logged there before. And this was the trip Galen referred to, that photo was taken in May. It would have been logged, I don't know, maybe a few months prior to that. And I don't think that the BC government data files will catch up with that logging for another 2 years. Maybe a year before that'll finally get processed and put into the BC government spatial database file. So the government is lagging behind the logging that they're permitting, even. Next slide. And what is this old growth that we're talking about? You know, you hear a lot of stuff, and I've actually lost the taste for talking numbers in a certain sense, because the numbers, you can pick whatever numbers support the opinion you already have, is what I find. And I'm just as guilty of it. You know, there's 2% of old growth left on the island. There's 15% of old growth left on the island. BC government does this really hilarious number game where they'll say, how do they frame it? They go, we have 55% of remaining old growth on Vancouver Island in protection. 55%, that's pretty good. That's half of the remaining old growth, more than half, in protection on Vancouver Island. Sounds pretty good in a press release coming from the BC government and Minister Doug Donaldson. But by that same logic, if we keep logging old growth, that number increases. 55% in 10 years is going to turn into 75%. So their numbers get better and better the more they permit old growth logging on the island. It's completely ridiculous the way that they do math. So instead of talking numbers about what old growth is and how much of it is left, because the forest sector will manage a land base with the intention of managing a parcel of forests to recuperate it as old growth. So if you go back a slide, they'll log this cut block here, and then on the maps, in their management plan, their forest stewardship plan, they'll designate that exact parcel, that same polygon, as old growth, and say that for the next 250 years, no one's gonna log that. And then they get to say that they're actually recuperating old growth in their management plan. So they literally call that old growth. It's an empty block. There isn't a stick of a tree in there. But they will designate that as old growth forest. And it throws the numbers for a loop. So back to the definition slide. So we can think about, one slide forward. We can think about old growth in the way that the BC government defines it, which is a stand of 250 years or older, or this coarse woody debris, tall, standing, rotting logs, so on and so forth. They call it old growth characteristics. So if they can find a high productivity second growth forest, maybe it was logged in the 20s, 30s, or something like that, but it was close to the coast, low elevation, maybe it's on a river, maybe it's on a salmon-bearing river. So high ecosystem function, that forest is gonna grow back pretty well, and it's gonna look good, and it's gonna have some of these characteristics. So the government will call a 100-year-old forest, 110-year-old forest that has been planted an old growth forest because it has some of these designations. Where other entities might call old growth forest areas of forests or forests of native species in which are no clearly there's no clearly visible indication of human activity and ecological processes are not significantly disturbed. So you remember the original and then the current day imagery of how much we've shifted, how much of this original forest cover that we've taken away, taken off the landscape. I'd say that we have significantly impacted the ecological function of this forest in ways that we may never understand. which drastically shifts the numbers you hear. So just whenever you're listening to me or the government or the industry or whatever, just know that there's a lot of latitude and semantics there, and you can play with numbers until the cows come home. Next slide. This is a friend of mine named James Dakota Smith. He's a Clogulf and Montegala colleague and friend. And this was the first time that he had come home to his territory. And this is in the Seneca. Maybe some of you know the Seneca River, a little tributary called Thursday Creek. Thursday Creek? Yeah. And of course, these ancient rainforests are cultural landscapes. They were managed by people to lesser or greater degrees depending on the location. And there's fingerprints, big and small footprints of 10,000 or more years of cultural activity in these forests. Next slide. And in the course of our field work in the last year or so, I'd say that the single greatest trend that we see at the front line of where ancient rainforests, old growth rainforests, Ackley are being logged is a vast sum of culturally modified trees being logged. This is a little cookie, a cross section of a bark harvested culturally modified tree. It's bark harvested on two sides there. So this tree here, at some point prior to the existence of Canada, this would have been 200 something years ago. In this case, a Moachat person, this is on Nootka Island, would have done a bark harvest and pulled the bark, the grains go up the tree, pulled that bark off, used it for fiber, whatever, clothing, baskets. And then that tree continued to grow. It has these healing lobes. You can see it looks like two kidney beans growing on either side of the heartwood there. They heal over like that. Often the heartwood dies right out. Coincidentally, it makes for really good habitat for birds, bugs, salamanders, bears, so on and so forth. So they are modifying through their traditional cultural practice this tree and leaving all sorts of cultural effects, features, could be falling trees for house posts, canoe logs, so on and so forth. And we see that at that outer front line where they're taking the last of the old growth forest right now, most of the time, if it's on a river or close to the coast, it's active cultural erasure of the cultural Ackley, the cultural forests that exist on Vancouver Island. Next slide. And at a time when people like Dakota are trying to come back, he's the first generation that didn't go through residential schools. His mother did, his father did, his grandfather did. He's trying to come back. He's trying to sort of reculture himself in a way with a relationship to the land base. And youth are getting back out on the territory, learning for themselves these bark harvesting practices. I think that it's sacrilege that logging companies are permitted to still log these cultural trees. Yeah.
When they prepare a cut block, does the government, aren't they required to identify culturally modified trees in the cut block?
Yeah, they are. There's a bit of a don't ask, don't tell effect that goes on. And I think they're feeling the pinch because so much logging has happened already that there's not a lot of places left to go that don't have heritage features throughout the forest. And so they're feeling this squeeze of their timber harvesting land base, and they're like trying to go to new spots and check out new blocks, but at the same time, there's a lot of indigenous cultures that are waking up to the fact that their ancestors were managing these resources in this way, and they don't want to they apply for what's called a heritage site alteration permit, which I think is funny because they do a little more than alter it. They log it and they take it away. They blast a road right through there. It's not very motivating for a company to report, that they've come into a high cultural heritage forest because it means they probably won't get to log it. So I think it's a rock and a hard place for a lot of them. I don't envy being in that position, you know, to be a forester trying to get a certain metric for their demands and having to, you know, work through this maze of cultural features in the landscape. It sounds interesting, but also really challenging. So it's a bit of a pickle with the industry right now. Next slide. But as nations wake up, and as nations sort of breathe life back into their management practices and try to get back out into the territory the way that they want to, nations like the New Chatland, which their territory is most of the northern 2/3 of Nootka Island, they're using their culturally modified trees to file their title case as evidence. So this tree, this one's actually from Monongahela territory, but they've gone and done an assessment on the culturally modified trees prior to 1846, the designation of British sovereignty, and if they can show that on the land base in living trees, that they were managing and stewarding that resource prior to Canada, that's evidence of their sovereignty at that date. And so right now they're in court following suit with the Chilcotin title decision, same legal precedent, and it's looking very likely that this nation will get their land back and steward those ancient forests and these cultural forests in a way they see fit. Next slide. We did a trip out to Nootka Island, and this is what their territory looks like right now. So the Nootka Island Trail, if anyone knows, this is my friend and colleague here, Troy. He's a photographer and an artist based in Tassus. That's Emily Hoffpower, works for the Wilderness Committee. And we were out on Nootka, and the Nootka Trail is about, I don't know, 2 miles that way from that picture, and again about a couple miles west of this picture. So the logging companies are coming out onto that western slope of Nootka Island that's never been logged before, and they're hammering every little corner they can get a logging road down into, including this one. This is a tree with a 31-foot circumference, and under Western Forest Products big tree policy, it's not big enough. So it's very likely that this tree is no longer there now. Next slide. But of course, while these are cultural landscapes, these are habitats and ecosystems, they're also our greatest tool to combat the climate crisis. And you can see here at a mid-northern latitude that runs across, there's a bit of red that runs a lot of BC, crosses over, what is that, a bit of Sweden, Norway, through the, I don't even know what country this would be over there, but you can see essentially the yellow is the boreal forest. The Amazon in orange, Indonesia, of course, there. And then in red, you can see it has the highest carbon sequestration density of anywhere. And one simple way to think about that is around the metabolism of a forest's abilities to sequester and then produce carbon. Because forests produce carbon too, but just like lungs, you inhale, you exhale on those seasonal basis. But if you go further north, it's so cold that they're not absorbing that much. And then if you go further south, there's a lot of carbon in the Amazon, but it also has such a big fluctuation between the rainy season and the dry season that it's producing a lot too. Lots of decay, rot, and then regrowth. Decay, rot, and regrowth. And so it has a bigger inhale and exhale of carbon, but we're kind of in the sweet spot where when the forests here absorb carbon, it tends to stay. So the trees get bigger, the biomass just builds. It doesn't get so cold that it's not absorbing much to begin with, and it doesn't get so warm that there's lots of rot, decay, reproducing. So we're in downtown global athlete carbon sequestration zone. If there's one thing we should be doing in our part of the world to play our part in the climate crisis, it's to keep old forests in the ground. Next slide. Also of interest is that our coastal temperate salmon athlete holds the highest average canopy height. So there's taller trees, forests that have taller canopies than ours, and there's ones that have smaller. But in terms of our average canopy height, we're it. We've got some of the tallest forests in the world. Next slide. And the single greatest source for unaccounted carbon that we produce into the atmosphere every single year comes from forestry. We tend to think that forestry is kind of a green industry, you know, we plant trees afterwards, it's all good. It's not really the case. A, because we don't count the carbon at all. Like, it's just not in our accounting. So you go to look at the BC government analysis on the different, you know, transportation, agriculture, fossil fuels, so on and so forth. Forestry's not in there. It doesn't make the cut. It's conveniently excluded from the way that we do our accounting on carbon, which in my opinion is a massive cop-out. Because you know who keeps score? Is the climate. It does not have any discretion. If the carbon is going into the atmosphere, the carbon is going into the atmosphere. And the forest sector, upon cutting, releases vast sums of carbon. And there's sort of an industry myth, next slide, that if you're replanting, that those trees, you know, you're taking old punky trees out of the system, they're just wasted space, you know, it doesn't matter. We need to plant new trees, and those new trees are gonna drink up carbon, and they're gonna be, you know, they're designed to absorb more carbon. Also a fallacy on a couple counts. One being that if you're doing the accounting properly, you're counting the carbon you're releasing upon cutting it, which is a lot. And then also, that tree, when you go and put a plug into the ground, that tree doesn't really start sequestering any meaningful amount of carbon until it's between 30 and 50 years old. We all know that we have about 10 years left to address the climate crisis. So we've just been producing carbon in the entire forest sector continuously for 90, shy of 100 years, continuing on. And even if we all go plant trees right now, we're not really gonna see the benefits of that carbon sequestration for another 30, 40, 50 years. And unfortunately, the timber harvesting pinch that the industry is struggling with right now means that they're shortening the rotations. They're trying to log younger trees just to keep that fiber supply going. So it's a rock and a hard place right now. And
You should have some old growth stumps on there though.
these ones are actually, this is a karst landscape up in the upper Tashish. This is all limestone. And the old growth forest grew right there, and it basically sucked up all the existing soils and minerals that existed there. So these are old growth stumps just clutching raw limestone. Fire pulled through there, logging pulled through there, and there is no soil in sight. That will never be a forest again, but it once was an incredible forest of these giant, giant trees with roots going all through this karst limestone. Amazing for water quality. Next slide. You get the idea. Old growth trees are the solution to the climate crisis. So we want to keep what fractured old growth we have left as a buffer for floods in your communities, for drinking water. You guys know about drinking water Comox. I was just hiking in Strathcona, looked at that Crookshank overpass there down at the upper Crookshank. They've hammered that whole upper section. They've put probably 7 or 8 more cut blocks in the very top of the Crookshank, right at that watershed there. That's where your water's from. Next slide. And these systems, you can see how lush and rich they are. That carbon just stays in there. It's like a bank, right? We basically need to take carbon, keep the savings of carbon in the bank that we have. You know, these are our tax-free savings accounts right here. We do not want to cash those in right now. And then we want to stop cutting them anymore. Next slide. So again, mature being the key word. At this point in time, with the climate crisis framing, it doesn't matter how many trees we plant. Trudeau's parading around saying he's going to plant all the trees in the world. That's going to do no one any favors in the next 10-year horizon. Next slide. So I always get coached on having no words in my slides because they're boring. Nobody wants to look at that. No one wants to read it anyways. So instead of actually putting words in all of my slides, I just put them all in one giant slide. So I'm going to pass this back over to Galen in a sec. But actually, go one more slide. You don't want to read that. We can go back to this if you want to review again. Go one more slide. This is just to sort of further illuminate the opportunity we have in this coastal temperate salmon athlete of where different carbon sinks actually are here. The blue dots of note Green, obviously of note, 100 tons per hectare. You can find us here, we're right in the middle of it. Next slide. The way that I sort of frame what we advocate for, both in terms of the colonial governments, which represent my community in the provincial government and the federal government, and then also the way that I try to relate to Indigenous jurisdiction, and the way that I advocate for economic diversity and justice for workers like the United Steelworkers right now, who are on strike against Western Forest Products, trying to take their pensions, holiday pay, benefit. We stand with those workers. We support those workers. We may have a disagreement about whether they should be logging old growth or not, but it still stands to reason that we support people's right to have safe and secure jobs, healthy benefits, so on and so forth, stability. So we call that modern diversified economic development. We don't want to have a one-track, one industry dependency in any of our communities because that makes ghost towns and it's hard on workers. And we think everything should be with a climate justice framing. Next slide. And of course, should I tell my joke, Galen?
Yeah.
You want me to tell a joke? So you guys know John Horgan. This is Doug Donaldson, the Minister of Forest, Lands, Natural Resources, Operations, and Rural Development. Talking to someone. What did the Assistant Deputy Minister say to the Minister when Mark and Galen showed up to protest their old growth policies? Donald Duck.
Oh.
And with that, I'll pass it over to Galen. You want to use the podium?
Yeah.
Hello, one question. Have you made any progress when they keep burning the slash rather than they were looking into some chipping or otherwise, and the result was it's too expensive? Have you made any progress that way? The
No.
burning?
Some of the companies claim to be putting transition plans in place, but without meaningful encouragement from government regulations, it's more expensive. You know, they're hemorrhaging jobs right now. Anyways, it's like hard for them to make progressive sort of policy shifts when the market conditions are kind of tough. And frankly, you'll see in I think it's in George Heyman's mandate letter to include slash burning in carbon accounting. They haven't done that. It was supposed to be announced in the last budget, and they didn't. They just conveniently took that out. So no, unfortunately.
So I'm just going to make a couple quick points and tell you what I'm doing on and what we're doing on the organizing side, what we're doing to protect old growth forests, and then we'll go to question and answer for the last bit here. So we've got the slide up of John Horgan and Forest Minister Doug Donaldson because it's the provincial government in BC that really has most of the power to protect old growth forests, and indeed they are choosing to allow, and even to through BCTS, we're logging. It's the BC government that's doing a lot of the old growth logging or allowing it. So at Sierra Club BC, we're working with other groups, Ancient Forest Alliance, Wilderness Committee, Canopy, to put pressure on the provincial government, to put pressure on Horgan and Doug Donaldson to do something, to make a change. We've been, starting to get some feedback from them. There's been, some points of good talk, but nothing we can really point to that's any kind of serious change thus far. Next slide. We have been sending electronic letters to Doug Donaldson, primarily to Horgan too. This is from our website. You can go to rainforestisland.ca. You can see estimated square meters of old growth clear cut in the island since large scale logging began, and if you go to the website, you'll see that number going up and up and up. So I encourage you to sign this letter. That's what we have here in the front. Now I understand that this is a nonpartisan group. Sierra Club BC, by the way, is also a nonpartisan group. We're totally 100% nonpartisan. We have to be. We choose to be, and we have to be because of charitable status. We are also, however, political. We're totally political. If the BC government is going to do things that we support, we're going to cheer them on, and if they're going to do things that aren't the right choice, we're going to speak against them, which we do. So I encourage you, before you go, if you want to send a letter to Doug Donaldson, all you have to do is sign your name and put your email, and then it goes. If you want to get involved, if you want to learn more about doing what we do, being a volunteer, you can also check the box there on that letter. Next slide. So here we are, a few months ago in front of Ron Ray Leonard's office, and this is part of a province-wide day of action where I think on this day in, let's see, what's the weather looking like? I guess this one actually goes back to February, doesn't it? We've done one in February, one in June. We don't have a date for the next one. Like I said, we work with these other groups. We do our best to get everyone on the same page. But for these days of action, we tend to have maybe 15 different locations around the province that are participating. There's actually a forest convergence happening in Nelson, organized by grassroots activists that I'll be at the end of this month. I'm really excited that I think there's a growing sense of concern around the forest. I mean, certainly, even reading the newspaper now, that thankfully the press is reporting more and more on what's happening in the forests. So this is really our chance to raise our voices and put pressure on the province to make a change. Next slide. So again, you can go to our website. We're talking about forests today, but as I mentioned at the beginning, we're working on a lot of different campaigns. We're working on stopping the Trans Mountain Pipeline. We're working on climate change in other ways. We have a renewable energy podcast and more. Check out our website. Next slide. And there I am with an old growth tree up in the Sitka region. So I'm going to turn it over to questions and answers, but I will just kind of make my pitch of we need people to raise their voices. If you've never written a letter to your MLA, that's a great place to start. The reason handwritten letters matter is because not that many people actually take the time to do it. So the real handwritten letters that they receive, they read, it does make a difference. If you've never written a letter to the editor, or if you have, do that. It's a great place to start. In any MLA office, they have activists who stop by regularly and are kind of a pain in the ass. And if they just have 2 or 3 of those people, then they can kind of ignore them and shrug them off. But if there are like 50 people who are showing up at their office at a regular basis talking about old growth forest protection, that becomes a real concern for those MLAs. So I really encourage you to be a pain in the ass. So I think we're gonna open it up for questions for either of us. Thanks. Yeah, let's start in the corner.
Okay, do you know if there was any action change in the provincial regulations as a result of the public consultations on the Range and Forest Practices Act and the Private Managed Lands Act?
Did everybody hear that?
No.
Okay, we're gonna try the mic.
Do you know if there were any changes in the provincial government regulations as a result of the public consultations on the Forest and Range Practices Act and the Private Forest Managed Lands Act?
Short answer is not yet. It's kind of slow going on those processes, so they receive input, and I think what they do is they process that input, and then they put out a discussion paper of like what they heard, kind of thing, and then that's open for discussion, and then there's maybe one more public session, or they tend to kind of pick and choose who they'd like to have be their public for certain processes, so they'll probably phone a couple friendly nonprofit groups, maybe a couple pro-logging First Nations, and then a couple logging companies, and get their input on the discussion paper for both private and for FERPA, but not yet. FERPA is still open even for a couple of weeks or a week or two, I think.
Oh, is it? I don't think so.
I think it's closed actually.
Yeah.
It's closed.
Yeah. But yeah, like you said, we're waiting to find out. We don't have reason to be excited about how it's going to address old growth logging. I guess I'll put it that way.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank you for talking about the Western Forest Products workers and talking about what you said about workers and the whole issue of jobs in the forest industry, and as soon as you hear protection of old growth, I know what it represents to all the loggers is that I'm going to lose my job. And I represented, I was a logger at Fowler for 22 years, and then I worked for 18 years for the Woodworkers Union, and was on the blockade we're going to the blockade in the Seneca for a week straight back when that happened. I've still got the
Which side of it?
Huh?
Which side of it?
Well, I had to deal with 150 loggers at East River every morning.
Yeah.
And I still got, when I got back to the office one day, I still got the memo from my secretary. She said, "Oh, you got a message here." And I got it still in my office at home. "Hey, white man, keep your fat ass, white ass out of the city. Native leader." That's what it said. So there's no phone number to call him back, but that was an interesting time at the Seneca. But I guess that's the point. The point is that we don't, a lot of times the loggers hear protection of old growth and losing jobs, and there's not enough talk about transitions and what's going to happen to loggers. And I know all the arguments about technology and job loss. I was considered, for a while, I was considered too green by the loggers and too brown by the environmentalists. So I kind of sometimes was walking down the middle of the street. But no, so I just want to say I appreciate what you said about Western Forest products, and because that's always something we got to consider.
Thanks.
Yeah, totally. I like to say they don't make environmentalists like they used to. You know, it's we don't have time to, I don't know, just dig our heels in on sort of antagonistic politics. And so I might be greener than you, but I still am not green enough for a lot of people either. So I'm maybe a half a notch on the other side of the middle of the road there. But yeah, no, I feel that, and it's true. You know, like I was down at East River the other day, and you go north of Campbell River, pretty well every single turnoff has a camp of guys sitting there, steelworkers sitting there, hanging out, drinking food, or drinking coffee and chatting, making food for one another, and in many respects, now's the time to find solidarity between folks that want to do conservation work, or find a diversified economic opportunity, and loggers.
Well, just quickly, I was involved in '73 when we got a pension plan for the IWA, with the industry, and now Western makes billions of dollars and millions of dollars, and you want to take the pension plan.
Yeah, it's not saving old growth that's killing jobs. It's international corporations.
Yeah.
And it's it's coming to a head now, which a lot of people projected it would. And past provincial governments have just kicked this down the road in terms of old growth, in terms of transitioning our forestry industry in general. And I think these governments have known it. They've not dealt with it, and now it's coming to a head. I saw a hand over here.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. My question also has to do with jobs, and it has to do with information. And I'm hoping you can help me out with the general trend line as far as what you know, without getting too deep into the weeds. One hears of technology reducing the need for manpower as they're getting the logs cut. And how is the trend line between a high-level measure like board feet cut and jobs per, without, as I say, pulling you into the weeds? How do you see the trend line on that?
Yeah, I have no idea. But I do know comparative analysis between provinces. And so per cubic meter of wood felled, let's see if I get this right, per cubic meter of wood harvested in the province of Quebec relative to the province of BC, they get, I think it's an 8-to-1 or a 5-to-1 ratio. So they're making about 6 or 7 times more jobs per cubic meter than we are. So that is a bit of I think a management thing where we maybe indulge the resource we have a little bit harder here. We don't work as hard to be more efficient with our cubic meters, to do more value-added work and so on and so forth. We've got a lot of wood, like there's a lot of forests out there, not the way that the global market market necessarily wants those forests, but there's a lot of forests. And if we were compounding more value-added jobs into what exists here on this land base, we could catch up with Quebec and get a similar ratio going. But they're way more efficient and get way more jobs than we, by a margin of about 5 to 8 times. It doesn't answer your question in terms of technology. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't
some
know.
people have said the new technology means the jobs are becoming so few that the impact
Yeah.
of the smaller communities isn't as big.
Oh, totally. That's the trend. I just don't have numbers for it.
Yeah, yeah.
And mills as well, right? Because so many of the mills have been tooled to take large timber, that's by and large to where they're trying to put into those mills, keep those mills going. They don't want to retool them because it costs a lot of money, so on and so forth. Plus the market likes old growth, tight grain, cedar and fir and whatever.
Did I see any hands in the back? Hand here.
I just wondered if that difference between Quebec and BC could be of how they're handling raw resources as compared to shipping, exporting the raw material out. Do you know?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. We have close access to salt water and a fairly large American and Asian market. Most of our wood goes south.
So that could be a good way to sustain more jobs
Yeah, totally.
in the future.
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks.
I mean, you see it, whether you're in Nanaimo or Port Alberni or in some of the smaller inlets, they bring entire tankers, like D-Day, just bring them right into the shore and load them up with wood. They never go to a major Canadian port, they don't go to the catalyst, they don't go to pulp and paper workers, they don't go to anybody here, they go straight abroad.
This is a trip down memory lane. Is the mic on?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I grew up in Westminster. My father was a mill worker at Canadian Forest, Canadian Western Lumber Company, Persia Mills. He also started the union there in 1939-40. Became Secretary Treasurer of the International Woodworkers of America.
Which union did he start?
IWA, yeah, which is now steel because of various politics of the situation. He died in 1961 of a heart attack when he was 51. I grew up in the forest. My first job was at Northwest Bay, working at HR Methanol and Export as a spark chaser when I was 15. You could work there at 15, had a driver's license at 15. Now it's an interesting experiment, my grandchildren. Just about 3 hours ago, cut to the chase here, I was approached by an employee of the city of Courtenay who informed me that on October the 24th, I should appear in my back lane, which is the so-called Greenway here in Courtenay. We're over in Crown Isle. We've been there now for 2 years. And we haven't stopped at every point where we wanted to put in wildflowers or try to green the space behind us, which is a strip of blacktop, carefully designed to kill trees. And it's called the Greenway. It's become a brownway because even though they put in a sprinkler system and they put in grass at the corner of this is right behind Costco, okay? It was the original Costco site, I'm told. But what they're going to do on the 24th is put in drought-resistant species. And I said, which ones are those? Thinking in terms of conifers, and replacing the cedar, which is drying through drought and lack of water. And they said, oh, for example, put in smoke bush. Smoke bush. Smoke bush.
I don't know what that is.
It's a shrub. It's a shrub.
Does it have another name?
Oh, probably.
Burning bush.
Burning bush. Macdonald Consumer Bader, if you're Presbyterian. Burning but not consumed. Okay, but this is the fight we have right now as a resident just of 2 years here in Courtenay on Prestwick Place, which is right behind Costco. Backing onto the Greenway, which is the reason why we came here from where we lived in Mount Vernon, Washington, is because of the standing timber, which is new growth, the reproduction from logging, which was clear cut through this area 50 or 60 years ago, maybe longer. And the mature trees, which are now 40, 50, 60 years old, are dying for lack of water because of western red cedar and they're shallow rooted. So the city has been very careful to put irrigation in where they're growing grass, okay? Newly installed. But the trees are allowed to die, and they're standing, and they're gonna have to be cut now because you can't reclaim that extent. So there has to be some better education, if you follow me, just right here in the city of Courtenay, to say what is needed. What is needed is water. And I got into trouble because 2 years ago when I saw that the western red cedar right behind us in the greenway was dying. In fact, it had a distressed crop of cones, and I put in a watering system, concealed as much as I could in grass. And now the wild blackberries have taken over that, so you can't see my hose, right? But I saved those trees. And so I think it's a good case for education. At that point, I'll shut up.
No, you're totally right. Yeah. And I think people's literacy around ecosystems is growing and widening. There's a breadth of knowledge out there that in my short lifetime I don't remember when I was younger. And I talk to younger kids now, they're definitely more literate, or at least thinking in terms of ecosystems more and more, and community planning more and more. So I think you're bang on. Any other questions?
Me?
So we've heard from both of you. I'm just looking around, going once, going twice. Okay.
Okay. So I recently learned about the Brooks Peninsula, and you mentioned it a couple times, and I was told that this is such a unique ecosystem because it was never covered by glaciers, and so there are completely unique species there. Can you talk about that in just a bit?
Mark knows it well.
Yeah, that's Plaskino, Quatsino, and Cayuga Chuckalton territory. That's the boundary there, that peninsula between Newchalmouth, West Coast nations, and Walk to the north. And yeah, because it sticks out like that, and glacial recession took place from west to east. I don't know whether it was never covered with ice or whether it was for like a long period of time the first place to not have ice on it. And so a lot of the ecosystem that we know as sort of coastal rainforest athlete came out from there. And so especially, there's a lot of hills and it's very kind of mountainous, I call them cones, all through there, and gullies and depressions and stuff, and then bogs. And then the immediate systems to either side, to the south in the Newchalmouth territory, and the north is a couple valleys called the Klaskisha and East Creek. And those are sort of two of the first valley bottom spots where those species, as glaciation was proceeding, finally hit the valley bottom, hit those lush valley bottom locations, and then that ecology sort of colonized out from there. And it's remarkable. I was in there a couple of years ago, and the loggers themselves call it Jurassic Park. That's their name for it. And in fact, if you remember one of the slides that I put up about carbon sequestration, and I talked about it being a tax-free savings account of carbon, that tree on the right, that's from Brooks Peninsula. And because it has a west coast exposure, the cedars, it's just a cannon of a trunk, and it goes up 10, 15 feet. And then because of the wind exposure to the west coast, it was just getting topped and blown over constantly. But then it shoots up candelabra branches, and it just made a castle. A lot of the trees are like big stumps and then clipped off, and then it's just maze of trees that we think of now as full-grown cedar trees. But 19, 20, 25 of these just on a single trunk, all through there. Yeah, absolutely amazing ecosystem.
Is it being logged?
Brooks is not. The peninsula is not. but they always try and take bites out of park areas or old growth management areas. And East Creek is a chunk of my broken heart because it's a big bite out of the Brooks McQueen Provincial Park that goes out into that ecosystem right there. And also Brooks itself had been logged prior to it being a park. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So no, Brooks itself as the peninsula is not, but the surrounding ecosystem is from all sides. There's no park on Vancouver Island that isn't having the contiguous nature of its surrounding old growth not logged. They cut, it's like scissors, like they literally cut along the park boundary. It's right at the edge.
Okay, we've got time for 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap it up.
I just want to quickly ask if there's an online petition as well through your website.
Great question, thank you. So there's a petition, or rather it's our letter to Doug Donaldson going around, or you can sign it here before you go out if you'd like to. You can also find it online, rainforestisland.ca, or just go to our website, sierraclub.bc.ca, and you can find it there. You can also get in touch with me, Galen at sierraclub.bc.ca. Last question here.
It's not actually a question, but I'm reading a book called Big Lonely Doug. I'm about 2/3 of the way through, and I found it fascinating, and it talks about all of this. And I mean, yeah, 2/3 of the way through, so I don't know how it ends, but what are your opinions of that book?
Well, I haven't read it. I've heard about it, and it's officially on my reading list. We were talking on the way up here about wanting to do a Sierra Club Forest Book Club, and that would be, I think, a really good contender. I think Big Lonely Doug, this lone old growth Doug fir standing in the middle of the clear cut, is just such a poignant, meaningful image, and kind of like tells a story of old growth. And so I would love to check out the book. Sounds like you recommend the first 2/3.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Final comment.
We do actually have time for comments.
Oh, we have more time. Okay.
Oh, I was just going to say, I recommend the last third of the book. It's fantastic. It's not just about that one tree. It includes the logging industry, and it's very well written. It's a wonderful book. I recommend it.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think it's time for a book club.
Yeah.
So we do have a bit of extra time if there's any other thoughts. Yeah.
The question I had when you were talking about the culturally used trees in your example here, economically, does that undermine a lot of the value in terms of use for boards? And does one assume then they're almost all used just for fiber? Just because when you see the segmented trees here, you don't have the big wide width for
tight
board.
grade. Yeah, totally. Yeah. It's funny actually when you mentioned that they're supposed to be identifying them. And, if either timber cruisers going through there or someone's doing block layout and they see that, are supposed to identify it, have a archaeology analysis come through and do a survey. Oftentimes when there's companies that don't have a ton of money, maybe they're a contractor, they don't really want to be doing big comprehensive work like that, and they're skipping steps in a sense, you can find which ones are the culturally modified trees because they'll just have rot spray painted on them. Because the core will be all rotted out. You can't even tell, sometimes it'll be completely healed over with a zipper. And if it's old enough, and if it's healed fast enough, it'll close up on itself and just kind of look like nothing particularly notable until it's logged and you can see that cross section. So yes, it often dequalifies it, but on the other hand, it's also really incredible shape locking. So a lot of the time, a company will come in, log a bunch, and then the ones that were like kind of hunky or whatever, or stunted growth and stuff, they'll drop them and then pick up their buddies that have shape locking outfit and say, hey, a couple of good chunks here. It wasn't good enough for us to take for full length boards, timber, whatever, but good enough for small sections to make shapes and shingle out and stuff. What's interesting about the CNTs, you see how small that one is? That's older than Canada. That's probably a 200 or 300 year old tree right there. Because it's been bark harvested on 2 sides, it's stunted its growth. So had that tree not been harvested, it would have bulked out a lot more. It'd been quite a large tree, so it's got tighter grain in there. But it's, yeah, you start counting the rings on that, it's a very old tree. To look at it, you might not even notice because it seems, you know, fairly small, maybe it's about second growth size, but you kind of get an eye for it after a while.
Questions, comments?
Sorry.
I got a question after.
I also recently read a blog by a bear biologist